Part 1. The Road to Raven's Hollow. Mark adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The road had stretched on for hours, winding through a seemingly endless forest, swallowed by a thick mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. His phone screen flashed no service, and the GPS had frozen miles ago, leaving him to navigate blind. The gas light blinked. 15 miles left. Mark sighed, scanning the road ahead. He had left the last town over an hour ago, expecting to reach his destination before dark. Now the sun had sunk below the horizon, and the world outside was wrapped in dim twilight. He was about to turn around when he spotted something up ahead, a wooden sign barely visible through the fog. Welcome to Raven's Hollow. Population, 214. A shiver ran down his spine. There was something unsettling about the sign, maybe the way the paint had peeled as if something had scratched at it. He shook off the thought and pressed forward. The town emerged from the mist like a ghostly memory. The main street was lined with old brick buildings, their windows dark. A single flickering streetlight cast long, distorted shadows. The town looked abandoned. Then he saw the gas station. A single pump stood in front of a rusted-out convenience store, its neon open sign blinking faintly. Relief flooded him. Mark pulled in and stepped out. The air was unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. The silence pressed down on him like a heavy weight. The station door creaked as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood an old man, his eyes sunken, his face pale and stretched with something between exhaustion and fear. Mark cleared his throat. "Hey, I need a fill-up. Do you take cash?" The old man didn't answer right away. He just stared. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he muttered, "You shouldn't be here." Mark frowned. "I just need gas. I'm passing through." The man's lips barely moved. No one passes through Raven's Hollow. Mark glanced around. The shelves were mostly empty, the flickering fluorescent lights barely illuminating the place. Then his eyes landed on a bulletin board by the door. His stomach twisted. Rows of missing person flyers. All recent. All with the same last known location, Raven's Hollow. Something about the old man's stare made the hairs on Mark's arms rise. He forced a laugh. "Is this some kind of local ghost story? You trying to scare me off?" The old man didn't laugh. He just handed Mark the gas key with a trembling hand. "Fill up and leave. Before sundown." Mark took the key and stepped outside, a deep unease settling in his chest. The gas station's clock read 7:13 p.m. The last traces of daylight were disappearing. As he started pumping, something caught his eye across the street, a figure standing just beyond the fog. A woman in a pale, tattered dress. She wasn't moving, just watching. A chill ran down his spine. He turned away for half a second. When he looked back, she was gone. The whispers started soon after. Part 2. A town that doesn't let you leave. Mark's hand tightened around the gas pump as a strange unease settled over him. The woman had vanished into the mist, but the eerie feeling of being watched remained, crawling under his skin like unseen insects. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Mark screwed the cap back on, glancing around. The town was utterly still. No cars. No people. No sound. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled as he walked back to the gas station to return the key. The old man hadn't moved from his spot behind the counter. His eyes followed Mark's every step. "Thanks," Mark muttered, placing the key on the counter. "How much do I owe you?" The old man's lips barely moved. "Just go." Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to take the man's advice, to get in his car and leave this place behind. But something nagged at him, a morbid curiosity, an itch in the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. "What's with all the missing person flyers?" he asked. The old man exhaled sharply. "People come here. They don't leave." Mark frowned. "What do you mean? You live here." The old man's gaze darkened. "I don't count." Mark didn't know what to say to that. The tension between them felt suffocating. He turned toward the door. And then he saw it. A man standing on the other side of the street, barely visible through the fog. He was still, unnaturally still, his body rigid, his head tilted at an odd angle. His clothes were old-fashioned, tattered, but that wasn't what sent a jolt of fear through Mark's chest. It was his face. His mouth was stitched shut. Thick, black threads pulled his lips together in uneven knots, and his hollow eyes stared straight ahead, empty but somehow aware. Mark stepped back instinctively. "What the hell?" The old man spoke in a whisper. "It's too late." A shadow passed by the window. Another figure. Then another. Silent people emerging from the mist. Their lips were all stitched shut. Mark's heart pounded. What's happening? The old man's voice was almost pleading. Run. Mark turned and bolted out the door, sprinting to his car. He yanked the handle, locked. His fingers scrambled in his pockets for the keys. A whisper brushed against his ear. You shouldn't have stopped. The air turned frigid. He spun around, no one was there. But the stitched-mouthed people were closer, surrounding him. Their heads tilted in unison, their empty eyes locked onto him. Mark's shaking hands finally found the key. He jammed it into the lock, threw the door open, and dived inside. The engine roared to life. He slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, but the road was no longer there. Instead of the street, his headlights illuminated an old, rotting wooden fence, stretching endlessly in both directions. Beyond it, darkness. As if the entire town had been swallowed by an abyss. His breath came in ragged gasps. He turned the wheel, aiming for a side street, but it wasn't there. The buildings had shifted. The town was changing. He wasn't leaving. A cold, guttural whisper filled his ears, overlapping voices hissing in unison. You belong to Raven's Hollow now. Part 3, No Way Out. Mark's hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His breathing was sharp and erratic. He slammed the gear into reverse, the tires screeching as he sped backward. The town blurred past him in streaks of fog and shadow. The stitched-mouthed people stood motionless on the sidewalks, their hollow eyes following him. Then, the car jerked violently, the back tires skidding as if he had crashed into something, but there was nothing there. Mark's head slammed into the steering wheel. The horn blared, a long, piercing wail that made his ears ring. He groaned and looked up. The street in front of him was no longer the same. He had reversed down the road, yet somehow he was back at the gas station. The old man stood in the doorway, his face twisted in something between pity and terror. I told you, he whispered. You can't leave. Mark's chest tightened. His hands trembled. No, this isn't real. This town isn't real. He yanked open the door and stepped out, his legs weak. His breath was visible in the freezing air, though it had been warm when he first arrived. The town had shifted. The buildings were wrong, leaning at odd angles as if collapsing in on themselves. Windows were covered in thick black grime, shapes shifting behind the glass. The streetlights flickered, but they cast no light beyond their own glow. Mark turned slowly. The stitched-mouthed people were closer now. Silent, staring, unmoving. Mark's heart pounded against his ribs. What do you want? He whispered. A cold gust of wind brushed against his neck, carrying a voice that wasn't his own. Stay. Mark turned and ran. He sprinted down the main street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The buildings twisted and warped as he passed them. The signs on the shops no longer made sense. Letters jumbled together, symbols that weren't part of any language. Then he saw it. A narrow alleyway between two buildings. A sliver of darkness, barely visible in the fog. His gut screamed no, but his instinct screamed run. He turned sharply into the alley. The moment he entered, the silence broke. A piercing, unnatural screech filled the air, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. Mark ran faster. The alley twisted and turned, impossibly long. The walls felt closer, the space narrowing around him. Shadows moved along the bricks, stretching toward him with long, clawed fingers. The screeching grew louder. Then, a light. A single flickering street lamp at the end of the alley. Beyond it, an opening. Safety. Mark pushed forward, lungs burning, every muscle screaming. He was almost there. Then, a hand shot out of the darkness. It grabbed his ankle. Cold. Ice cold. Fingers dug into his skin, pulling, yanking him backward. Mark screamed. He kicked, thrashed, his fingernails scraping against the rough brick walls. He turned his head, trying to see what had him. He wished he hadn't. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow. A tall, crawling thing, its face a gaping black void. And in the center of that void, a stitched mouth. More hands shot out from the darkness, gripping his arms, his legs, dragging him back. The light at the end of the alley flickered once. Then it died. Mark was swallowed by the dark. Part 4, The Hollow Place. Mark's body hit the ground hard. The air in his lungs vanished as he was dragged deeper into the abyss. His fingers scraped against the rough stone beneath him, but it wasn't the pavement anymore. It was cold, wet earth. He clawed at the ground, desperate to stop his descent, but the hands held tight. They weren't just pulling him. They were swallowing him. The darkness thickened around him, pressing against his skin like damp cloth. The only sound was his own frantic breathing. Then silence. The hands released him. Mark gasped, pushing himself onto all fours. His entire body trembled. The air was stale, suffocating, dead. It smelled of dirt and decay. He was no longer in the alley. He was somewhere else. Cavern? A tunnel? The walls pulsed like they were alive, shifting in the dim, pulsing glow of unseen light. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing in from all sides. Mark stood up slowly. His breath came in shallow gulps. A sound echoed through the space. A whisper. No, not a whisper. Many. Layered voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. Then, a shape moved in the distance. Mark's entire body locked up. Something stood just beyond the faint glow. Tall. Wrong. Watching. Its body was stretched, its limbs too long, its fingers curled like claws. But its face was nothing. A void. Except for the stitches. Thick, jagged stitches sealing its mouth shut. Mark stepped backward. The thing moved forward. He turned to run, but the walls closed in. The tunnel was no longer a tunnel. The space twisted, bending in impossible angles. Mark's breath hitched. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder. Then, the stitches on the creature's mouth began to tear. One by one, the black threads unraveled, revealing something far worse than a mouth. It wasn't teeth. It wasn't human. It was another eye. A watching, pulsing, hungry eye. The voices screamed. Mark tried to close his eyes, but it didn't matter. The thing saw him. It knew him. And then, the world collapsed. Part 5, The Endless Gaze. Mark's body collapsed, his knees striking the cold, damp earth beneath him. His mind screamed for him to move, to fight, to escape, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed. The eye in the creature's mouth blinked, oozing some dark, viscous liquid that dripped onto the cavern floor. The whispers did not stop. They were inside his head now, crawling beneath his skull, pressing into his thoughts. Not words, not voices, memories. His memories. Images flashed behind his eyes. His childhood home, his mother's voice, the time he broke his arm riding a bike. Then, not his memories. He saw a town he had never been to. People he had never met. They were running. Screaming. Something was hunting them. Something with stitched mouths and watching eyes. Mark felt his body being pulled again. This time upward. The creature loomed over him, its stitched lips fully unraveled, the massive eyes staring into his soul. Then it spoke. Not with words. Not with sound. But with a feeling. Knows you. Mark choked on a scream as the cavern tore apart around him. The walls split open, revealing impossible landscapes. Twisting corridors that spiraled into darkness, streets that led nowhere, faces without eyes staring through windows. Raven's Hollow. The town wasn't a town. It was a cage. And the thing before him? It wasn't alone. From the shadows more shapes emerged. Their mouths stitched shut. Their hollow eyes weeping black tears. They had been waiting for him. And now he belonged to them. Part 6, The Hollow Ones. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps. His chest felt tight like something was pressing down on him, something unseen, something inside him. The creatures watched. More and more crawled from the darkness, their grotesque figures shifting through the twisting cavern. Their stitched mouths trembled, the black threads tightening and loosening as if barely holding back something terrible. Mark's muscles locked. He tried to scream, to move, but his body refused to obey. Then they spoke. Not in words. Not with voices. With thoughts. You are home now. Mark's vision blurred. The cavern around him shifted, melting like wax, the walls rippling and stretching until they became something else entirely. A town. He was back in Raven's Hollow. But something was wrong. The streets curled inward, the buildings loomed too high, their windows like empty, staring eyes. The gas station was there, but it was abandoned, covered in black vines that pulsed like veins. Mark turned to run, and came face to face with the gas station clerk. But the old man's face was gone. Where his mouth should have been was only stitches. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets, dripping with black liquid that never hit the ground. You are home now. The words rang through Mark's skull, his knees buckling beneath him. No, he whispered. His voice felt distant, disconnected. I'm not supposed to be here. The sky darkened. No sun. No stars. Just an endless black void, pressing down like an ocean above him. Mark stumbled backward, heart slamming in his chest. He turned, searching for the road, the highway he'd come from, but it was gone. In its place stood a massive, crumbling church. Its steeple twisted into the sky, the wood charred black as if it had burned for centuries. The doors stood open, beckoning. And standing in the doorway, was himself. Mark's own face stared back at him, pale and lifeless. But the other Mark's mouth was stitched shut, and his eyes were wide, staring, knowing. The creatures closed in. "You are home now." Mark's mind snapped. He ran. Straight into the church. Straight into the dark. Part 7. The Church of the Forgotten. Mark's footsteps pounded against the warped wooden floor as he sprinted through the gaping doors of the church. The air inside was thick and damp, heavy with the stench of burned wood and something rotten. The moment he crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening boom. Total darkness. The only sound was his ragged breathing. Mark reached for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. Nothing. His fingers trembled as he pressed the power button again. The screen stayed black. A whisper crawled through the darkness. Not one whisper. Thousands. Mark's pulse hammered in his skull. He wasn't alone. A dim, flickering light blazed to life at the front of the church. A candelabra, its wax-covered arms dripping like melting flesh. The flames flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that moved on their own. The pews were filled. Not with people. With figures, all motionless, slumped forward as if in silent prayer. Mark took a cautious step forward, his heartbeat deafening in his ears. The figures were dressed in black, heads bowed, hands clasped together. Their skin was pale, too pale, like wax, like mannequins left in the dark too long. The closer he got, the more he realized they weren't breathing. His foot creaked against the wooden floor. All at once their heads snapped up. Their mouths were stitched shut. Mark staggered back, his chest tightening with panic. The figures didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their hollow eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then the priest stepped forward. A tall, skeletal figure in tattered black robes, his face hidden beneath a cracked, porcelain mask. His hands, long and bony, held a large ancient book, its cover writhing as though it were alive. The priest slowly raised his head. Beneath the mask there were no eyes, only emptiness. A voice echoed in Mark's mind, crawling into his skull like wriggling insects. "You have come to the house of the forgotten." Mark's knees threatened to give out. The whispers around him grew louder, rising into a low, unnatural chant. The priest lifted the book, opening it with deliberate slowness. The pages were not paper. They were skin, stitched together, covered in names. Names that moved, shifting on the surface like trapped souls trying to escape. The priest's finger traced the pages, stopping midway. Mark's name was there, written in fresh, bleeding ink. "Your place is prepared," the priest intoned. The congregation stood in unison. The stitched mouths began to rip open. Mark turned and ran.